Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you who were at the Ohio Aquaculture meeting a couple months ago, I was a presenter there, and some of the material you'll see here is similar. I apologize, but we just kicked off our first year of research, and I don't have a whole lot of new results to show you yet. So I'm here today to talk to you about the Soy-Aquaculture Alliance. We're a company based out of Indianapolis, and I'll talk about what we are here in just a little bit. All right, so real quick, I'm going to just go over the outline of what we'll be talking about here today, idea of who we are. Then I'm going to talk about our investments into aquaculture, and then go into exactly what is the Soy-Aquaculture Alliance and talk about some of our key programs. And then give you, if we have enough time, I'll go over a quick case study of some of the work that we've done. So first of all, the Soy Association world. I was at a meeting back in February, and I heard someone say that it was the best description I've heard. The federal government got up and said that the soybean world is association rich. So I really like the way he phrased that. So I've got up on the screen just a couple of the organizations that we have out there. This top one, our Soy Check Off, that's the United Soybean Board. And then we have the American Soybean Association. Then we have the U.S. Soybean Export Council, and then down here is the Ohio Soybean Council. There are many more than that. In total, there's probably 40, well actually probably 60-some soybean organizations. So first I'll tell you a little bit about the Soybean Check Off. When a soy farmer goes in and sells his beans, 0.5% of the sales goes into this check-off program that can be used for research and development of new markets for soybeans, new production technologies for soybeans, those type of activities. That money is collected in each state where the soybeans are grown, and then half the money is sent to our national company, the United Soybean Board, and then the other half stays in each state. So here in Ohio, we have the Ohio Soybean Council is the state checkoff board, which is called a Qualified State Soybean Board. So I know they're helping sponsor this meeting today, and that's through the state soybean checkoff. Then we also have the American Soybean Association. This is a membership-driven organization that can go into Washington, D.C. and lobby Congress. That's one of the prohibitions for checkoff dollars. We can't use those dollars for any type of lobbying activities, so we have membership organizations that can handle that. And then in addition to the American Soybean Association, each soybean producing state has their own state association that can lobby within the state, and also they'll send members to D.C. And then the last one I'll talk about is the U.S. Soybean Export Council. This is the organization that's in charge of getting our products marketed in all of our various overseas markets. And the big one for us is China. The saying is that 1 out of every 4 rows of soybeans you see grown in the United States winds up in China. So it's a huge focus for our efforts because they are such a huge consumer of U.S. soy. So I'm going to now move into what we're doing in terms of investments into aquaculture. This has been something that the soybean world has been heavily involved in for many years. Even before the checkoff was started in the early 90s, we were doing aquaculture work through our membership side, and we've actually had an office in China for 30 years. So why are we so interested in looking at aquaculture? This is the global supply of fish meal. And you can see it's a relatively flat line. And if you add a trend line, you even see a slight decline in the availability of fish meal. And fish meal is always considered the premier protein source for aquaculture feeds. So we have a huge growing industry. I'm sure you have all seen the numbers for how rapidly the global aquaculture industry is growing, and yet the protein source that is most preferred for our industry is flatlined or slightly declining. So we need to look at, the soybean world looked at this and said we need to start focusing on this market because their traditional feed supply is not going to meet their coming demand. And if the estimates right now are that between 70 to 80% of the global supply of both fish meal and fish oil are being used by aquaculture. And there are other competitive markets for those feeds. The swine industry uses some fish meal. For the oil side, I'm sure you've seen those little oil capsules that you can buy at the store. That's another huge competitor for fish oil. So there are other markets out there for these products, so they are very expensive now. Fish meal can sell for $1,800 a ton. It's gotten up to as high as $2,000 a ton. Fish oil, over $2,000 a ton. So these are very expensive products now. that have caused fish feeds. For those of you who are already involved in the industry, I'm sure you're aware of how high fish feed prices have gotten, and this is just part of the reason. So we already talked about there's no chance for increasing availability of fish meal or oil. So what are we going to feed them? Well, if you look at the nutritional qualities of soybean meal, it's very competitive compared to fish meal. And if you look at total volume of supply, there isn't another protein source available on the commodity market at the volume that soybean meal is available. So it's a natural fit for fish feed. And in fact, most people don't realize this. They think fish meal is the #1 protein source used in aqua feeds. That is not the case. We are currently using about 10 million metric tons of soy products in fish feeds globally. If you look at fish meal, we're using about 4 million metric tons. So we are more than twice fish meal when it comes to inclusion in fish feeds. And these numbers are supplied to us by our international marketing branch, U.S. Soybean Export Council. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this slide, but what I really want you to focus on this is, we've recognized aquaculture as a major market, but back in 2002, we really decided we needed to focus our efforts and really develop the nutritional research to get more soy into feeds, because we do see some limitations in certain species of fish. And the first one we identified was salmonids. There are certain components of soy that when you feed it to salmon, they don't do very well. They get intestinal problems. So we set up an initial study to look at what anti-nutritional factors in the soybean is causing these issues, and this was a huge project. This is when I first got involved working for soybean, and it involved several universities. I was at Purdue at the time, and it also involved Dr. Dabrowski here at Ohio State. That project went on for about 3 years looking at salmon. Then we moved into marine shrimp, which is another huge global aquaculture market. And then we recently, about 5 years ago, switched our focus to some of the more marine species of fish. And this is all to increase the amount of inclusion of soy in the feed. Especially as we move to marine fish, those animals tend to be carnivorous. And when you try to feed a carnivorous animal a plant product, you tend to have some issues. So we're working to overcome those issues. So our approach has been to start with basic nutritional research, get an understanding of the essential nutrient requirements, the amino acid requirements, fatty acids, what's the digestibility for our ingredients, those type of things that as you learn more about nutrition, you realize these are kind of the critical issues you have to deal with. And then we evaluate soy-based feeds to maximize the amount of soy we can get into that diet. And then we take that work that's done a lot of, as you saw from that previous slide, a lot of university work, and we then take that out and give it to our field staff. And we have field staff in every major aquaculture producing country in the world except for Norway. They've developed their own industry. But pretty much anywhere else where there's a major aquaculture industry, we've got field staff working directly with that country's extension service to get more soy into feeds. And but let's talk a little bit about domestic aquaculture, since we're here in Ohio. We do estimate that the Soy Check Off has invested about $14 million over the last 5 years in developing the domestic aquaculture industry. And this is through various nutritional research projects as well as other type of projects to help increase the marketing skills of some of our producers. And then in addition to that $14 million, I'm not going to try to estimate how much that we've invested internationally. I would say we're probably doing multi-million dollars per year on our international aquaculture markets. Okay, so now we're going to move into what is the Soy-Aquaculture Alliance. So why another soybean organization? I went over there earlier how many different ones there are, probably around 60 or so. But what we are starting to see is there's a concern of where we're going to get seafood here in the United States over the coming decades as the global market situation has changed vastly. And I'm sure you guys have seen this, that's why you're here. We believe if we don't grow it here in the U.S., we're not going to eat it anymore. And I think there's some good statistics to back that up. If you look at fish consumption in the U.S., it has flatlined and actually decreased just a little bit over the last couple of years. And I say that's primarily because of price. We are now in a global competitive market, and we have countries like China and India consuming more seafood. That's driving the price of the available supply up, and what we've seen American consumer is we're not going to pay a whole lot more for our seafood. So if we don't figure out a way to grow it here at an affordable price, we're going to continue to eat less and less seafood. And as far as for our soybean farmers, they want to see a domestic market developed because they like to sell their beans locally. Now, a couple of stats here. The United States is the second largest consumer of seafood in the world behind China. We just recently passed Japan. Japan was number 2 for a long time, and we've actually passed them in terms of total volume of seafood consumption. On a per capita basis, China is much higher than the U.S., but total volume for a country, we are higher. But we're currently importing about 90% of our seafood. So this is not a sustainable model. The global economy is changing. According to the Chinese government, they became a net importer of seafood in 2010. Ask a soybean farmer what happens to a commodity market when China becomes a net importer of anything. It completely changes the global dynamics. This is a projection of what's going to happen in China over the next decade. You can see they're predicting a doubling in seafood consumption. So, major producing countries, aquaculture countries, are now starting to change the target of where they want to sell their products. Previously, the U.S. has been kind of considered the primary market, the U.S. and Europe. This is where aquaculture producing countries want to sell their product because they know they can get a premium for it if they sell in these lucrative markets. This is not the case anymore with what's happened in the global economy. Last year, we saw a 7.2% decline in shrimp imports. This was the biggest decline since 1995. Thailand is our major supplier of farmed shrimp. They decreased imports to the U.S. over the last 3 months, the last quarter of 2012, 30% decrease. They are shipping more and more of their product to China. China will pay more for shrimp than we will. 8% decline in tilapia imports in January of 2013 compared to year-to-date 2012. These are 2 of the most common seafood items Americans like to eat. Shrimp is number 1. I think tilapia is number 4. And we are seeing major declines in the import market. So like I said earlier, if we don't grow it, where are we going to get it? And when you look at the top 10 list of what we like to eat, most of these items are imported. Shrimp, most of our salmon's imported, and the red ones are all species we can farm. Tilapia imported, Pangasius imported. So here, channel catfish, U.S. grown. That's the highest one on the list, and that is 7th. So there's a lot of opportunity to get into these already proven aquaculture markets if we can figure out how to grow them here in the U.S. So why are soybean organizations involved in this? I talked a little bit about that earlier. Why did we start SAA? It's because we're funding a lot of projects. I showed you that dollar amount of what we're doing, but there are so many organizations, that 60+ organizations. We were not doing a good job of coordinating our efforts. We weren't talking to each other, and what we found out is that we were funding a lot of similar projects with the exact same researchers and had no idea about this. Until in 2007, I was hired in Indiana to run an aquaculture program, and I was the first aquaculture specialist for any soybean organization at the state level. So when I started getting a lot of phone calls from the other soybean producing states saying, hey, we got this aquaculture proposal, can you review it? Because they just don't have the technical expertise on their staffs. And as I got more and more of these phone calls, I realized, hey, Iowa's funding this almost exact same project. So we decided it's time to start coordinating our efforts and focus what we're doing because, believe it or not, our funds are limited. A lot of people think the soybean has deep pockets, but we do have limited resources. And at this point, international markets are more of our focus for aquaculture. So the domestic side, we definitely have limited resources, so it just made sense to do a better job coordinating our efforts. We see that potential domestic market for U.S. soy, and we also see a potential, the U.S. is a leader in aquaculture technology development, and there is potential here that we could start supplying an export market if we can do things right. So the Soy-Aquaculture Alliance is a membership organization. We're primarily made up of the state soybean boards that I talked about earlier, but we also have some commercial partners. Right now, Bell Aquaculture, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them. They are actually a member of our organization and highly supportive and active in all of our efforts. So now I'm going to go over some of our key goals, and I think I've got about 10 minutes left here, so I think I have enough time. When we started this organization, research was really considered to be our top priority. We want to do really sound research that's going to help break some of these technological barriers that we've seen in adopting soy into feeds. So the first thing we did was we put together what we call the Science and Technology Advisory Panel. This is a group of about 10 industry leaders who help us identify our top research priorities. What do we need to do to increase the amount of soy in feeds? And this group helped us identify 3 major areas for our first year of research. I mentioned earlier we got studies going on right now. These are the areas that we decided to focus on. First one is taurine requirements of fish. I talked earlier about carnivores. What we have found in fish is when you take out the fish meal and you start feeding them plant-based ingredients, especially the carnivorous fish, we see a decrease in production. And we kind of scratching our head wondering why. Well, it was figured out that taurine, it could be a limiting essential nutrient. And taurine is a lot of times called the 11th essential amino acid. It's not really an amino acid, but I'm not going to get into those specifics here with you. But it follows in that amino acid chain. And if you look at cats, cats require taurine in their feed. If cats don't get taurine, they'll die. And cats are strict carnivores. When you look at meat products tend to have high levels of taurine in it. Plant products do not. So we came up with the idea then that taurine may be a limiting nutrient in some of these carnivorous fish feeds. And studies have been done by excellent researchers throughout the world looking at taurine requirements. And what we found is, yeah, we do believe this is an essential nutrient, and it's lacking in soy. Very high levels of taurine in fish meal, virtually none in soy. So that's one of our projects, and I'll show you some more details on that here in just a second. We're also looking at the impacts of soy-based feeds on the actual waste output from fish. Soy can cause diarrhea in salmon. And think about the environmental implications of aquaculture. And when you think about the waste coming out of that fish, if you're growing either salmon in an indoor recirculating system or out in a net pen, think about how hard it is to collect a solid that's liquid. Collect a waste that is liquid, as opposed to collecting a solid waste. So this is definitely an issue that we're working on to try to overcome. And what can we do to make that the waste more solid? Oh, wrong button. And then the last area we looked at, there was an article in the World Aquaculture Society magazine, I think late last year now, that was looking at the global breeding industry for aquaculture. And right now, less than 9% of the global industry is using a traditional breeding program. So basically, if you're raising fish, you're using wild fish is what we're looking at. And this is a huge issue. You got disease issues, you have limited production issues because you're dealing with a wild animal that isn't raised to be farmed. So we are actually doing some work to look at, can we ramp up some of these genetic selection programs to more quickly domesticate these fish so that when a farmer goes to get his supply of fingerlings, it'll actually be a domesticated animal and not a wild animal. Then whenever we do research, we put together a team of experts to peer review these proposals, and then that comes back to our STAT panel, and they make recommendations to our board of directors for funding. So the projects that we're doing right now, and hopefully if we do this again next year, I'll actually have some results to show you. In the genetics category, we're funding 2 projects. One at the University of Idaho. We're trying to actually get down and look for genetic markers in that fish that indicate soy tolerance. And we're working with rainbow trout because that's kind of viewed as a model species that can be used then to identify similar markers in other fish to help us increase the amount of plant-based feeds. Then we're also doing a project with a company called Integrated Aquaculture International, basically trying to do the same thing in marine shrimp. Then on the waste output side, we're doing the work with ARS. Rick Barros is out in Montana. He's kind of considered the feed manufacturing guru. He works for the Agricultural Research Service, and they are going to evaluate the effects of soy products on the waste output of rainbow trout. And then the last one, the taurine. The reason we're doing this is we're pretty sure it's a required nutrient, but we are not allowed to add taurine into feeds in the United States. You cannot buy a synthetic taurine source and put it in your feed. Even though it's required for your fish, you cannot put it in feed. You can put it in cat food because we don't eat cats, thankfully. But the ironic part is if you go buy a bottle of 5-Hour Energy off the store shelf, look at the ingredients, you'll see taurine. So we can eat taurine, but FDA won't let us put it in fish food. So they gave us a list of things we need to do to establish that it's required. And when we put out our call for proposals, these 2 proposals right here, one from Auburn, one for Texas A&M, gave us the ability to check off every one of those items on the list. So our goal is once those projects are done, we take this back to the FDA and we should be able to get taurine approved for fish feed here in the U.S. Okay, I don't have much time to get into details here, but quickly we'll go through a case study of how we approach our research project, and this will be doing yellow perch. I mentioned Bell earlier, they're a strong supporter of what we do, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the fish that they're raising. So the yellow perch industry, this used to be a huge commercial fishing industry in the Great Lakes, and it completely died out for the most part. I know there's still some in Lake Erie. But Bell Aquaculture came online about 5 or 6 years ago looking at raising yellow perch, and now they're producing millions of pounds of this fish per year. So definitely a success story in that. But there is no yellow perch feed available on the market. So if you're going to raise perch, you're basically going to use a trout diet to feed your animals. So we did some work back when I was at Purdue. Basically took a yellow perch, established a couple of amino acid requirements, ground up the fish, and looked at the whole body concentration of amino acids in that fish. And you can kind of use that to figure out what are the essential amino acid requirements of yellow perch. I won't go into more detail on that, but that's basically what we did to come up with a theoretical formula that can be used to feed this animal instead of using a trout diet. And then once we determined what those theoretical essential amino acid concentrations were, we did some basic in-house research when I was at Purdue. And then after I left Purdue, I went to work for the soybean world. We started working directly with Bell Aquaculture to test some of these feeds at a commercial level and worked with a feed mill to actually produce these feeds. So here's just a sample diet of what we established and used with Bell Aquaculture. You can see the soybean meal, we managed to get up to 25%, which a typical trout diet that you might be using might have 10 to 12% soy meal. So we more than doubled the amount of soy meal you can get into a perch feed. The diet we used, it worked pretty good, or well, but it wasn't great. They were having some of those issues that I talked about earlier with water quality and getting some cloudy water because the fish waste wasn't as solid as they would have liked to have seen. So we decided to move into using some new soy products that are being bred more for aquaculture. And they're breeding certain qualities out of the soybean and breeding in certain other traits. And this is all through traditional breeding techniques. We're seeing a higher protein soy now available with low carbohydrates. And we believe that the carbohydrates are part of what's causing the problems when we feed high levels of soy in these fish. And so we conducted a trial using some of these new varieties of soy. And what we saw was very encouraging results. Here's some look at some experimental diets that we used. And you can see we went from 20% fish meal down to 0% fish meal. And here's a special variety of soy. We got that as high as almost 60% of the diet. And if you look at the results, you can see right here, FCRs for all the feeds were really, really good, below 1, which is not atypical to get FCRs below 1 in a research project. And you can see very little difference between these feeds. They all perform very well. So what we basically came to the conclusion is that you can just about remove all the fish meal from these feeds. And if you look at them and compare to the commercial feed, look at the percent weight gains here. Each one of our test diets outperformed the commercial rainbow trout feed that they were using. So really very promising results, and the key limiting factor now is just to get these specialty varieties of soybeans, get the production ramped up so we can get them more commercially available. They are commercially available now, but at a very limited supply.